Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on designing digital trade provisions in the African Continental Free Trade Area, lessons from existing trade agreements. My name is Jamie McLeod. I'll be your moderator for this session. I'm a trade expert at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, where I've worked on supporting this work, supports the AfCFTA negotiations, and leading our work on e-commerce and digital trade for the last half a decade. This session, we're very privileged to have a really nice range of speakers with us. First of all, the session will be structured with the main part of it, which is a presentation from Karishma Banga. Karishma is an economist focusing on international trade, digitalization and development, and she's the research fellow at the Digital Technology Cluster in the Institute of Development Studies, and also the Digital Trade Policy Advisor at the Commonwealth Businesswomen's Network. But someone who has a great range of experience in this area, having led many research products, many of which we at UNEC have partnered on over the last 5 or so years. After that, we'll be hearing from more of the policy angle with Jean-Bertrand Abzapmo, who is the principal advisor on trade and industry at the African Union, someone with over 17 years of experience in trade and trade-related policy formulation, negotiations and implementation, including in Africa and the Asia-Pacific region, and someone who's provided strategic guidance to the African Union Commission on the AfCFTA negotiations, but also on the development of policy in this area, including the African Union Digital Transformation Strategy and the African Union Digital Trade Strategy. We'll then follow that up by hearing from the private sector. In particular, we have Rose Magas, who's the CEO of Rova Digital, an entrepreneur in her own right for 15 years, leading on implementing a number of projects, integrating artificial intelligence and machine learning, and someone who's passionate about using technology for impact. Following that, we'll range our private sector perspectives to hear from Job Wanjohi, who's the head of policy advocacy for the Kenyan Association of Manufacturers, an industry body. So they're hearing from beyond just the private sector involved in maybe specifically the tech sector to more broadly from the manufacturers in Kenya specifically. But before that, I have the opportunity, somewhat maybe perhaps abusing as my being chair of this session, to give something of an introduction to the importance of this issue, and also sharing from some of our recent research at UNECA, some of the findings about how e-commerce and digital trade has changed rapidly in the last year and a half under the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. But first of all, so the context we find ourselves in is one for myself been following for a while, since really in 2016, when we saw e-commerce emerge as a really important topic in the WTO, with a number of issues papers, non-papers, and suggestions for proposals for negotiations, pushed mainly by a group of more developed countries. And it has been argued with particular interests of large tech businesses, looking for a mandate for negotiations on e-commerce in the WTO. As we know, and that was in the lead up to 2017 ministerial, as we know, those attempts to secure a mandate for negotiations on e-commerce at the WTO failed. Developing countries failed to see sufficient interest for them to bind themselves to rules in this area, despite what would often be narratives around the importance of e-commerce for development and for SMEs in particular, by proponents of a mandate for those negotiations. So not finding a mandate in the WTO, negotiations on e-commerce have migrated elsewhere to the Joint Statement Initiative, plurilaterally, but also regional arrangements. And this can include, for instance, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and what's of specific interest to us here today, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the announcement that will include an e-commerce protocol. So as I mentioned, our session is anchored really by a presentation by Karishma, someone who we at UNEC have partnered with many times. And it seeks to identify what lessons can be drawn from countries negotiating e-commerce agreements who had more similar levels of development to Africa, And then beyond that, we then seek to hear from Jean-Bertrand Azapmo, his perspectives coming from a policy angle of the African Union, and then a little bit the voices from the private sector as well. But before we get into this, as I said, I wanted to share some of our research findings recently at UNECA. Ours have been a little bit more nuanced than what is sometimes projected by the global think tanks. It's a story of COVID-19 having accelerated digitalization and e-commerce across the world. What we found in our research was that in African countries, the story has been, yes, including those pressures for digitalization, but frustrated in many respects by a lack of digital economy foundations. And this is captured in a quote I'd like to share from that research from one of our interview respondents and an entrepreneur behind two of Africa's top businesses, that's Flutterwave and Andela. And he said to us that COVID-19 exposed certain deficiencies in some ways, yet accelerated certain aspects of our businesses in others. There were a bunch of building blocks we need to work on, issues like unaffordable internet and limited coverage. And this was a barrier to maximize the opportunity of COVID-19 to scale the digital world. A lot of people could not be reached, and there's a need to improve the foundations of the digital economy in Africa. And in our research, we investigated what those missing digital economy foundations may be. And we came up with 4 answers. These were internet, digital payments, postal systems, and digital skills. Firstly, the internet. Here we find the cost, reliability, and quality of internet in African countries to be lacking as really a foundational constraint here. Only a third of Africans, just less than that actually, currently have access or use the internet. And this statistic is lower than 10% for almost a third of the African countries, bringing out there really the diversity of the continent, because we're not just speaking about the Kenyas and Nigerias here, we're speaking about the Nigers and the Sierra Leones as well. And here in our research, what we suggest is that one of the issues here is the lack of competitiveness or competition between internet service providers. And this is something that the AfCFTA could broach, for instance, in their negotiations on services and trade in services. As many as 13 African countries have mobile broadband markets characterized as only partially competitive or fully monopolistic. So as you see, a lot of lack of competition there. But as well as that, only 28 African countries have a competition authority to be able to enforce sufficient competition when you do have more of those internet service providers. The second issue, digital payments. Of course, we have mobile money in East Africa and increasingly West Africa as well. But still, Africa's online payment environment is characterized by very small, only 4% I read, of Africans with having credit cards. And so some of the key recommendations we found there were to carefully and diligently give more teleco operators mobile money licenses to improve the competitiveness and the availability of mobile money as a solution for digital payments. Then we have postal delivery systems. So only 16% of Africans currently can receive mail at home. And Africa's postal reach and reliability scores are substantially lower than for other developing regions, of course, being a constraint to receiving physical goods in the e-commerce space. But those 3 constraints help create a marketplace for e-commerce in Africa. But we need to go beyond that to ensure that African countries and the people are creating value, jobs, and value added in this space. And so for that, what we also need is digital skills development. In addition to that, the final part of the puzzle is the digital regulatory system created by, amongst other factors, international trade agreements between countries, including the African Continental Free Trade Area. And it is to this that we now turn in the central presentation of our session by Karishma Banga, which is on designing digital trade provisions in the AfCFTA and lessons from existing trade agreements. So Karishma, thank you very much, and please over to you.
Hello. Am I audible now?
We can hear you, yes.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, Jamie, for chairing today's session, and thanks to everyone for joining in. So as Jamie mentioned, I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, IDS at UK, and I'm also the Digital Trade Policy Advisor at the Commonwealth Business Women's Network. And today I'm going to be presenting some of the findings from our work on designing digital trade provisions in the AfCFTA and what lessons we can learn from South-South trade agreements. So as Jamie mentioned, e-commerce has spiked globally, both business to business and business to consumers. But e-commerce revenues in Africa have remained small at around 16%, and more so for the services sector than the manufacturing sector. And this is what the ECA study has shown that Jamie was mentioning. And on top of that, e-commerce in Africa is very concentrated, with just 10 African countries accounting for 94% of all the online business on the continent. And this is majorly domestic e-commerce with very limited cross-border e-commerce. And intra-Africa e-commerce continues to be limited due to a range of issues that has been spoken of just now, including transactional platforms requiring only domestic sellers on the platforms, or only 28% of the marketplaces offering online payment transactions, as well as issues related to postal competence, delivery and transportation costs, issues around taxation, awareness of rules, as well as lack of consumer protection. So I won't go into this in much detail because we've already heard about this. But what our research also showed was, and we interviewed 31 African firms last year during COVID. And what we found was that there's also differences in the use of e-commerce models across African firms. So the micro, small, and medium enterprises, they tend to use e-commerce through their own e-commerce enabled websites rather than register on these third-party large platforms. And as a result, they incur different fees related to development of these websites, maintenance, repair, and costs. And when we ask the private sector what they regard as the topmost priorities or critical regulations for the AfCFTA to address to boost intra-regional e-commerce, we find that majority of the firms ranked harmonized laws for taxation as the top most important regulation, followed by consumer protection to build digital trust, harmonized laws on electronic trade and digital signatures, as well as harmonized laws on data protection and privacy. So this is from the African private sector itself. But currently what we're finding is that at the global level, the digital trade narrative is heavily being dominated and shaped by technology firms in developed countries. So if you look at this, if you look at the chart, it shows that in the last decade, the ICT lobbying in the US has drastically shot up, reaching to almost 80 million US dollars just last year in 2020. And the ICT lobbying expenditure by the likes of Facebook and Amazon have actually doubled in just 5 years. So this just goes to show how significantly this is shaping the digital trade narrative. And the issues being lobbied for have gone beyond domestic issues, seeking cross-border data flows, bans on data localization and source code sharing, as well as bans on custom duties on electronically transmitted products. But since no consensus has been reached at the multilateral level, these digital trade agendas are largely being pushed forward through bilateral and regional trade agreements, as Jamie also mentioned. And so we think it is critical to look at how these norms are being shaped up in these smaller settings, because that will critically impact the evolution of future multilateral agreements. And here we think in particularly South-South trade agreements offer a very interesting and critical insight into what the AfCFTA can be doing for digital trade. And this is because countries in the global south, including African countries, face very similar contextual and political constraints to innovation, and also face similar issues around capacity. So what we do is that we limit our analysis to 60 preferential trade agreements that are South-South, so signed between southern countries. And we look at how digital trade provisions feature in them. So the obvious, the most important thing that emerges from these, from this analysis is that African countries are facing, a whole gamut of issues when they talk about e-commerce. So this is in terms of defining e-commerce. So this is a potentially contentious issue because should we define e-commerce products as digital goods or digital services? And to avoid taking an explicit position on this ongoing debate on classification of e-commerce products, we find that several regional trade agreements include e-commerce rules under a separate chapter altogether. So if you look at the South-South trade agreements here, we find that of the 60 South-South trade agreements, 30% have an e-commerce provision. And of that, 20% actually have a separate e-commerce chapter to avoid taking this position on e-commerce. The second range of issues is around the scope of e-commerce. So whether or not and where to address issues that are related to e-commerce, such as trade facilitation, online payments, postal infrastructure, competition and intellectual property, to name a few. And the third set of issues is around the depth of e-commerce, or how binding should the commitments be in these trade agreements. So these can be hard commitments, which are legally enforceable by the law, or these can be soft commitments, which are more sort of best effort provisions, or have the language of working towards or promoting a certain objective. And interestingly here, we find that there is a very strong and clear preference for facilitation provisions such as cooperation in South-South trade agreements when they look at digital trade. So they tend to involve a lot more softer language when talking about digital trade, partly in order to retain flexibilities to make laws on these issues. So when we look at South-South trade agreements, we find that the top 3 digital trade provisions that tend to feature in these agreements are provisions on data protection and privacy, provision on electronic authentication and digital certificates, as well as provision on consumer protection, including online consumer protection. And interestingly, these are the 3 priorities that we just discussed as also been highlighted by the African private sector in what is critical in the AfCFTA to boost e-commerce. So clearly there's a synergy emerging here. And we find that provisions banning requirement of source code transfer, as well as provisions limiting or banning requirements of data localization, are actually quite unpopular in South-South trade agreement. In fact, no South-South trade agreement has a provision that bans requirements for source code transfer. So coming to the main, so the first set of issues around data protection and privacy, which I mentioned is the most common digital trade provision in South-South trade agreements. So we find that 23% of the agreements have such a provision, typically requiring signatory countries to have some sort of legal protection on data, on personal data or data privacy of any kind. But only 2% of these commitments are hard commitments, which are enforceable by law. So this means that most of the digital trade provisions around data protection and privacy are best endeavor encouragements. So therefore, they're in much softer language, which is not legally enforceable, but encourages countries to have cooperation frameworks in place. The African Union Digital Transformation Strategy already had aimed to bring the Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection into force by 2020. And this would have required the countries to have a whole set of sort of issues around e-transaction, cybercrime, and data protection. However, as of 2020, only 8 African countries have ratified this convention. And it is worth mentioning that when African countries enter into negotiations, they are coming from very uneven and fragmented levels of data protection, with only 28 of 54 African countries having an active data protection law in place. 32 countries have some sort of data privacy law that mentions the existence of a data protection authority for enforcement of these laws. But in 15 of them, these authorities haven't yet been appointed. And this is the major obstacle that is constraining effective data protection legislation. And even in the countries that have data protection authorities, there are lots of disparities emerging. So some countries such as Ghana are far ahead in terms of enforcement of these laws, while others such as Morocco and Nigeria are lagging behind. And here, regional economic communities offer very important lessons. So if you look at the ECOWAS, they have a regional data protection agreement that establishes the content required of a data privacy law for each member of the regional bloc, including the composition of a data protection authority. AfCFTA could formally establish a mechanism for cooperation and facilitate the creation of regional data protection authorities, because this can help address challenges related to some of the national data protection authorities, including that related to independence, financial constraints, and institutional capacities. And this sort of a regional approach will be particularly useful for the smaller states like Malawi, which may not have sort of financial resources to create national data protection authorities. When we come down to electronic trade facilitation, which is the second most common provision, we find that 21% of South-South trade agreements have a provision on electronic authentication and digital signatures, and 20% also include targeted provisions for small and medium enterprises, so to facilitate their engagement in electronic trade facilitation. And that is something that we think that AfCFTA can also follow, to have those specific targeted provisions for SMEs. Only 33 out of African countries as yet have a formal e-transaction legislation in place. So clearly there's quite a bit of a divide still existing. The AfCFTA should also aim to adopt a single common digital certificate of origin, to create a standard platform that can be accessed by all exporters as well as administrative agencies on the continent. And here we have some excellent examples emerging already from regional communities, including SADC, which just last year piloted its electronic certificate of origin and kind of harmonized the laws around automation of registration of the certificate and transition. But here, the one drawback we find is that there is absence in most of these laws of references related to international aspects of e-commerce, such as choice of law. So for instance, some countries like South Africa practice technology neutrality, where a physical signature has the same legal bounds as a digital signature, but other countries, some members of ECOWAS, for instance, prefer technology, are technology specific, in the sense that they use key public infrastructure to regulate signature. So here there is a point of contention emerging. On the third set of issues around cross-border data flows and data storage, so this is another very interesting part to look at in trade agreements. On the one hand, you have proponents of data localization, proponents arguing that data localization should be banned because it increases the compliance costs for foreign firms and can therefore deter foreign investment. But on the other hand, you have several developing countries, including India and South Africa, arguing that data localization or the policy space, retaining the policy space to have those laws is an important way of protecting their legitimate capacity to restrict flows of citizens' data for national security purposes, government surveillance, or even for economic purposes. In South-South trade agreements, we find that provisions allowing free flow of data and banning data localizations are actually not popular at all. Only 12% of South-South trade agreements have an e-commerce chapter with a provision for cross-border flow of data, and only 8% have a provision banning data localization requirements. So clearly, when South-South countries are trading with each other, they tend to retain the policy space on issues related to data flows and data storage. And this is particularly important for the African continent because even in the African Union's digital transformation strategy, data centers have been regarded as a crucial tool for the development of the local digital industry and to attract investment. Here again, data sharing within the regional economic communities is slowly gaining traction. We find that pooling of regional data and building regional digital capacities can facilitate cost savings and unlock economies of scales to create regional data centers and processing capabilities. And here it is very important that we go beyond looking at measures around data storage and data flows to actually look at data processing capabilities within the continent. So as I mentioned, we did a survey of 31 African firms, and 19 of these firms expressed the need for an intra-regional data sharing platform for boosting e-commerce. But there were key concerns here around competitive advantage. So I've included a quote here which kind of just signifies this issue from a leather manufacturing firm in Kenya, which said that we collect data internally, but are not able to use the data much to establish patterns. My main concern in data sharing is privacy and protecting our competitive advantage. So this kind of highlights the importance of adopting a regional approach to building some of these critical capabilities. And just before I conclude, I wanted to highlight a couple of cross-cutting issues as well. So one issue that has emerged significantly is consumer protection, which is very important to build online and digital trust amongst consumers. And here we find that, interestingly, the North-South regional trade agreements tend to have a stronger interest in consumer protection than South-South agreements. So 21% of South-South trade agreements have a provision on consumer protection, but none of them are actually binding. And I think personally, this is more political than it is economic, because these countries are coming from varied colonial pasts and have very significant sovereignty-based constraints, which enable them to conduct in more sort of diplomatic relations than having very hard dispute resolution mechanisms in place, which are enforceable by law. The second cross-cutting issue which has emerged is around source code sharing. And here again, as I mentioned before, no South-South agreement bans countries from requiring access to or transfer of source code. And we find a similar thing emerging from the private sector in Africa as well, where 90% of the firms express the need to access digital intelligence generated by platforms using their own data and advocate for tech transfer from foreign firms to African firms. A regional approach here could be more effective in negotiating access to source codes, but this would again require policies around data protection and privacy. And just as a sort of last reflection, so our analysis of South-South trade agreements, as well as our interviews with the African private sector, have clearly highlighted that the important e-commerce topics include data protection and privacy, followed by electronic trade facilitation and consumer protection. AfCFTA could use soft language and best endeavors to solidify common positions and to create a digital cooperation framework on some of these key issues while retaining policy space and flexibilities. The AfCFTA can employ language to encourage the ratification of the already existing AU Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, but also create a guiding framework for intra-regional data sharing that is consistent with members' interest in protecting their privacy and security. And if, for instance, regulators want to retain control of specific data, such as data related to health or financial services, there is a possibility of exploring sector-specific policies in the AfCFTA as well. And lastly, it is critical to have in place specific provisions to address challenges faced by MSMEs and women, because as I mentioned before, the kind of e-commerce models they use are very different, and therefore a much more targeted approach is needed to ensure inclusive e-commerce uptake by them. Yeah, thank you.
Karishma, thank you so much for joining us and sharing that excellent presentation with us. I think we should say as well that this presentation draws from two papers which can be found online, one on digital trade provisions in the AfCFTA, what can we learn from South-South trade agreements, and also a second one on e-commerce and preferential trade agreements, implications for the African farms in the African Continental Free Trade Area. Maybe, Karishma, you could share those in the chat, the links to those studies, just so that those of us online can easily link through to them. Next, I'll pass on to our policy panelist. That's Jean-Bertrand Azapmo, who I introduced earlier. I believe I did see your name online, Jean-Bertrand, so you should be able to take the floor. And I'd like to pass to you kind of an extended question, which is for you, first of all, to explain what the African Union Digital Transformation Strategy and the AU Digital Trade Strategy do to give a vision and a framework to e-commerce and digital developments in Africa. And then maybe to elaborate the strategic direction that they give to the design of the AfCFTA e-commerce protocol, and in which maybe highlighting three things that negotiators might prioritize to ensure that the AfCFTA e-commerce protocol realizes those strategies. So Jean-Bertrand, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for associating us to this very important event. I also want to greet my colleagues, panelists, the co-panelists, and all the participants. And thank you for the question. I had some slides, although I'm not quite sure as to whether I'm allowed to share my my screen. Is it possible?
I believe it should be possible. Is there a screen share option at the bottom for you?
Yes. Okay, let me just So what I'm going to do, let me just go directly to the issues you raised. I will skip the context of the digital transformation strategy, which is basically which relates to some of the things you shared earlier. That is the continued expansion of e-commerce on the continent, especially during the COVID-19, and we also see an explosion of players, which signals the awareness, the recognition that perhaps what Africa actually needs to do in order to boost intra-African trade, it is to shift towards e-commerce. Let me therefore just look at the digital transformation strategy, which you referred to. This is actually a continental policy framework. It's a blueprint because it sets the vision that the continent would want to achieve in as far as digital transformation is concerned. So the idea is basically to achieve an integrated and inclusive digital society and economy that contributes towards improving the quality of life of African citizens. I think that's, in summary, what the digital transformation strategy for Africa seeks to achieve. What is very important with the strategy is one of the very first specific objective of the strategy. It is to build a secure digital single market by 2030 to support the African continental free trade area. So, as the strategy was being developed and adopted back in 2020, the idea of establishing a single digital single market was there, and the idea also of supporting the AfCFTA was already there. Just looking at some of the main principles, they are there: solidarity and cooperation among the member states, the AU and the regional economic communities, a comprehensive ecosystem approach. This is recognizing that, it's a legislative framework on its own will not actually help Africa harness the potential of digital trade or the digital economy. You need to look at all the pieces of the puzzle. It has to be transformative, inclusiveness. What is very clear is that gone is the era where policymakers from government will sit in offices and draft policies for the transformation of the continent. No, that is not going to happen with e-commerce or with digital trade or the digital economy. The policy making process needs to be more inclusive. Same for the implementation process. Homegrown, because there is a need also to take into consideration, Africa's unique features. And a new mindset is also required. I talked about the transformative aspect, the inclusiveness, and finally, safety, because I think Karishma insisted on that trust. And I remember a former ANTAT SG once said, the thing with e-commerce is when you complete your transaction online and you're about to click on pay, you also sit and pray because you're not quite sure whether you will receive the goods you are ordering or whether you will receive, if you receive them, in what condition and things like that. So safety, is very important here. Those are some of the strategic pillars, the cross-cutting themes, and the main sectors identified in the strategy. Now, turning to the e-commerce strategy, which is something which is it is an aspect of the digital transformation strategy, but looking at a particular component. The idea is basically to galvanize African policymakers towards a common vision for e-commerce that contributes to the Agenda 2063, as well as progressing towards a common continental market. So here also, it's basically the same underlining understanding to have e-commerce as a supportive, as a lever to intra-African trade, as a tool that will support the realization of the AfCFTA, the African Common Market, and eventually the African Economic Community. So there are a number of areas that are covered in the strategy itself, starting with a diagnosis of the ecosystem and touching, a number of key issues, digital identity, marketplaces, fintech, domestic and cross-border logistics. This is very important. I think you yourself, Jamie, mentioned the challenges of delivering goods that are ordered online. And then the ICT infrastructure, there is still this a gap, which will have to be looked into, and the issue of cyber law framework. There are also issues of investment promotion, digital entrepreneurship, as well as the enabling environment with a focus on digital taxation. So those are some of the things that are covered in the strategy itself. And the strategy also recognizes that, like I said earlier, a legal framework on its own will not bring the kind of transformation that we want to see through e-commerce. There is obviously this issue of a maturity gap or e-readiness. Some countries are more ready than others. I think Karishma also talked about it. You have countries that have the necessary domestic legislative policy and legislative framework in place. Others do not. In some countries where there is implementation is an issue. So there would be a need to bridge that gap. And this is recognizing that for us to be able to achieve a single digital market, we need to bring all the 55 member states at an acceptable level. I mean, we may not achieve, the same level, but the gap shouldn't be too much. Then there are issues of harmonization and interoperability. This is very important, whether in terms of cyber laws, payment, even e-transactions. So these are some of the key issues that will have to be looked into. Of course, the need to also look into best practices and recognizing that policymakers will have to be bring up to speed so that they embrace the negotiations with a very open-minded, because some of the things Karishma highlighted in her presentation are very often due to the limited understanding of the complexity and the dynamics of e-commerce. So it is very important that the capacity building program that was agreed by the head of state is implemented as AfCFTA negotiators get ready for the talks. Now, let me conclude with some of the key issues that will have to be looked into. Of course, harmonization, and at some point, uniformization is going to be very important, but starting with harmonization, because there is an understanding that countries may go into the negotiations with their national interest in mind. And we have issues such as trade facilitation, cross-border payment. There was a discussion about the AU Convention on data protection, cyber security and data protection. Those legislation are very, very important, so to the point where something the AfCFTA negotiators should probably consider, it is to look at the broad range of issues that actually affect e-commerce and at least agree on some key principles, regarding those. And so this is where harmonization, I wouldn't focus on uniformization for the time being, but harmonization and interoperability will have to be some of the key principles. There would also be a need to consider other legislative, other pieces of the legislative puzzle. And here we're looking at investment laws, IP rights, and competition. This is an opportunity, for the negotiators who are currently working on those issues to not to forget them or not to treat them as issues that are entirely separate from the conversation on e-commerce. Then there is obviously the issue of infrastructure, which will have to be looked into. And here, what is interesting is that member states have not yet, for some, concluded negotiations on their tariff concessions for trading goods. It will be very interesting and very important for the member state to bear this in mind, make the necessary concessions that are necessary to ensure that investment can take place in the infrastructure sector. And very important also the issue of sustainability. Now, one of the weaknesses of the existing framework pertains to issues of sustainable development. I know climate change has also been identified as one of them, but broadly speaking, issues of sustainable development. One of the questions going forward is going to be, how do we make sure that, as we talked about building back together and better, that we translate these into the e-commerce protocol. So coming up with a better e-commerce protocol will mean addressing the issues of sustainability, the issues of trust, the issues of consumer protection, and making sure that we create an environment, the kind of healthy environment where the big companies can thrive side by side with SMEs. And here we're talking about competition. So this is why a comprehensive and integrated approach is very important. And some of the legislations that are outside the e-commerce protocol are going to be critical going forward. I wouldn't dwell much on the issue of, soft law versus hard law, in as much as harmonization could be achieved. I think that will be the best way going forward. Some concluding remarks. What is important is we need to think beyond legislative considerations. And this is because, like I said earlier, it will take more than just a framework to be able to harness the potential of digital trade, the digital economy, and e-commerce on the continent. 4 things which are necessary. The first is adaptive policy making. We have a number of policies, whether at the continental or regional level, and even at domestic level, which have been in place for quite some time, and which will contribute to advancing e-commerce on the continent. Now, the issue is, or one of the issues is, some of those pieces of legislations are very old and need to be adapted. And we know the common practice on the continent. Policymakers, lawmakers are a bit slow in adapting legislation. So there is a need for constant adaptations. When you talk to, countries that have made important steps in advancing e-commerce, they will tell you the number of legislation that they've been able to pass in a year, it's incredible. So it is very important that member states bear that in mind. The second thing, consultative and collaborative policy making is also very important. Like I said earlier, gone is the era where governments on their own will make policies or legislations. It is very important because of the complexity, the dynamic of e-commerce, that the private sector, that the other stakeholders are brought on board. Because there are certain areas where actually the private sector could take the lead in establishing standards, guidelines, or code of conduct that will help them to really fast track e-commerce on the continent. Of course, African countries should also make sure that they actively participate in the discussions at the global level regarding the framework of e-commerce. This is important because we will then be able to safeguard the policy space at that level. Final point, I spoke about the inclusive process and sustainable e-commerce in Africa. This is going to be very important. Africa has been trading, traditional trade for ages with the rest of the world after the independence. But when you look at the inequalities on the continent, it is clear that trade hasn't brought the type of transformative changes that we would want to see on the continent. There is high hope that e-commerce can change things, but that will only happen if the sustainability dimension is brought on board. And like I said, it is not just going to be restricted to an e-commerce protocol. It has to extend to other areas of other legislative aspect, investment, competition, intellectual property right, you name it. And of course, the issue of you need an adaptive government to do all of that. I thank you, Jamie, and apologies if I've gone a bit beyond the time, but the issue of is very important, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Jean-Bertrand. That was a very comprehensive coverage from the policymaker's perspective of some of the policy frameworks, the priorities, and also moving beyond what might be the most obvious kind of policy issues beyond the legislative frameworks as well. Thank you so much, Jean-Bertrand. Next, I guess we've heard from the researchers, we've heard from the policymakers, now on to the private sector. Rose, let me pass over to you and ask, as a leading digital entrepreneur in Kenya, what are the three main challenges you face in scaling up into and across other African markets? And what would you like to see the AfCFTA e-commerce protocol achieve to effectively boost inter-African e-commerce? Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. And greetings to my fellow panelists. Karishma, that was a great presentation. John Bernard, the insights you've shared are really spot on, and hoping to hear from Joe as we go along. I think for me, from the questions that you have asked, Jamie, and initially I was listening to your introductory remarks and I was just thinking whether I shared my notes with you prior to that, because you literally touched on the same things that I was going to talk about. So really, we know that the digital economy is here with us. However, the African continent is yet to fully exploit the fourth industrial revolution. That notwithstanding, there's been progress made within Kenya as a country and Africa as a continent. But again, the challenges, as you've asked me to talk about the challenges, I know most of these challenges will not surprise anyone here. But one, the first thing is access to reliable internet. Yes, this is the Zoom era. We still have issues with internet access, especially for the SMEs, making access to digital tools a big challenge, and therefore being able to accelerate e-commerce. And we know that across the continent, we probably have the SME businesses make up close to 70% of the businesses within the continent. So when you have a problem with the internet access, then it really tells you that a lot of the SMEs are not able to get online and accelerate that. And the COVID-19 pandemic, as most people have said, that then exposed us to, what digital can do. But really it exposed us to the reality that the internet access within the African continent is still wanting. As Karishma said, there were people that could not be reached during that time, and that becomes a challenge. The other thing that I know is very common here, having done business within the continent and using internet and using technology, is that security and fraud remain a key challenge. The general African population, you will note that is very quick to trust without going through a verification process. Unfortunately, it then follows that once bitten, twice shy, and therefore there's an quote, evidence-based mistrust or fear of technology, and that to both the individuals and the businesses at large. So when you approach an individual or an SME and tell them, oh, technology can do ABCD, they're looking back at you and saying, well, the last time I tried this is what happened. My bank account was hacked, or I saw, I ordered things online, never got them, the person disappeared, I don't have ways to access them. And then the other challenge that we continue to face, and I think becomes a very big critical component for the AfCFTA to look at, is really the disconnect between policy and innovation. Again, it's an argument that people would make, egg or chicken, which one comes first? But we continue to see very big disparities between the policies across the countries. And case in example, we can just see in 2020, we had Kenya introduce an ICT practitioners bill. Now, on one end, you have organizations requiring this certificate to do business, yet on the other side, there is no criteria, and really, what comes first? Do you become, there is no, with the technology that is there, anyone can go online, learn a number of things and be able to, offer an innovative solution. But then again, you're introducing a bill that then needs to slow that down and not enabling for business. We even saw during the pandemic, for example, and this I'm speaking from Kenya, is the government was very categorical about online learning. It said it's not allowed, full stop. Whatever you want to do. We had children out of school for more than 8 months, and that was just what it was. And when we look at that, you wonder, where is innovation going to be supported by policy and that kind of thing? Now, the second part that you were asking me about is what would I like to see the protocol, the AfCFTA protocol achieve to effectively boost intra-Africa e-commerce trade. The first thing I would say is I'd like to see more ministerial meetings, stroke roundtables with the private sector. Why do I say that? There is a big difference across industries that needs to be embraced and given the necessary attention, rather than lumped together in implementing the trade agreements across nations. So it's really important to have these small groups, the ministers that are in the same industry, meeting together with the private sector and looking at it from that particular perspective and taking a deep dive. What is it that needs to work here? What is it that we actually need to put together? What is it that we need to live in, in a devolved environment, because it's going to be very complicated and retrogressive to actually implement that and standardize that. So I believe that would be one of those particular things. The other thing that I would say I would like to see is the transport interconnectivity. Again, I think, Jamie, in your presentation, you talked about the postal system and really, the delivery system. How do you get these across from one country to another? Because today the e-commerce has enabled us to buy goods with a click of a button, but there's still no urgency placed on the transport interconnectivity. So yes, I will buy it today, whether I will get it or not, whether I'm going to get it within 6 months, whether I'm going to get it within 3 days, then doesn't make sense that we have enabled the fact that I can be able to buy online, I can be able to transfer the money and give it to the seller and then stay there waiting. Because the advantage that the e-commerce then has to the business is I will receive money before I offer the service or the goods to you. However, if I'm going to, as a consumer, give you money and then wait for goods for so long, I would rather walk to a place where I can actually go exchange money for the goods and not go onto the e-commerce platforms. So again, the third thing is the internet connectivity and improved data management. Tracking of goods along the routes remains a challenge. I know that a simple example is there are still many places where you cannot order an Uber because of absence of internet. So as much as we do have the technology around to support that, we still cannot be able to use those services because one, our data management around that area, who is giving, when I, for example, order an Uber, I don't have an address as such. I don't have a specific address. So I move a bit, or if I'm not at home and I'm giving the PIN location to whoever is doing the delivery, they still have to get there and still have to ask somebody. If they get on location and their phone goes off, they cannot be able to communicate because we do not have a clear data management of, the postal system, the delivery system, the address really being put clearly. So I think for me, those would be the key areas. Of course, there are other areas around standardization of payment systems for goods. Bitcoin would be a big thing that would be that AfCFTA need to look at. And then the continued conversation that we've had over the years, even before the introduction of AfCFTA, remains the non-tariff barriers. How can we get rid of those over and over? So back to you, Jim. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You're hearing the reality on the ground from Nairobi, I'm sure. And now passing over to Job to finish up this session, again, with your perspective now coming as a policy advocate for the manufacturing sector in Kenya. And the same kind of questions, what are the three main challenges you see to digitalization in that sector in Africa? And what would you like to see the AfCFTA protocol achieve to help African manufacturing firms to adopt new digital technologies and expand trade across the continent? And I should say, before I pass over to you, Job, there's a couple of questions have been asked online. I'd appreciate it, panelists, if you have a chance to respond to those in written. And Job, I'll let you finish off the session, I think, because we get cut off quite summarily at the 8:30 hour. So let's bear in mind 4 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you so much. One thing is to note that all the presenters have done some great work. It's like we had notes before. So whatever I'm going to deliver is just buttressing or supporting what has been presented. Three main challenges that I see in digitization in Africa. One of it is the lack of capital, digitization of manufacturing processes. You find that the digitization of manufacturing processes is huge investment that requires a large capital outlay. Capital being a scarce factor of production in Africa is only available to firms that can present collaterals or collateral security. Large firms are thus in a stronger position to undertake digitization as compared to small and medium-sized manufacturers. So that's one of the major challenges that we feel that we are facing at the moment at digitization in Africa. Second one is inadequate technical capacity to implement advanced manufacturing technologies, whereby you find that most African manufacturing firms lack the relevant knowledge to implement complex manufacturing processes in a safe and secure manner, something that has been talked about by other presenters. Processes such as machine learning, advanced data analytics, artificial intelligence, use of robotic require some sense of specialized expertise to implement. The other thing is cyber security. You find that digital processes entail using of sensitive manufacturing information upon adoption. This sensitive information must be protected to manage multiple risks from potential cyber threats. So you find that cybersecurity has, and is this something else that has been presented about in the past? The other thing is the replacement of obsolete system. Rose talked about moving to fourth industrial revolution from the third industrial revolution. We are lagging behind. If you go to Europe, go to Americas, go to part of Asia, you see that as far as replacement of obsolete system is happening faster than what is happening in Africa. You have also asked the question about Africa Continental Free Trade Area protocols and what digital technologies can be adopted so that we can have more trade across Africa. One is need to promote harmonization of data protection law. We have heard of regional data of agencies. So at such now we can have data protection law at a regional perspective so that coming up so that we can be able to prevent the cybercrime activities. There should also be provision for integration of data markets by having open standards while having provision for consistent upgrading of this platform. Also, what I feel is that there is need for development and constant upgrading of digital payment platforms along regulation governing the digital payment processes. We also need to have digital mechanisms somehow to establish rules of origin, which while participating in the trade, or when we're talking of participating in intra-African trade. This is what this is going to help us in doing, is to ensure that we are locking out the non-originating manufactured goods within Africa. The other thing is having identified ICT as one of these services to be liberalized. In the first phase of services liberalization, there's need for continental regulatory cooperation in this sector to make the liberalization process a success. So we feel that African Continental Free Trade Area is a major step forward, and also it's something that is going to benefit Africa very much. But if you look at where we are as far as digitization is concerned, there are various other steps that we need to make, coupled with hardware. I'm talking of the infrastructure development, because once we have the digitization within Africa, then the movement of goods and services need also to be facilitated with enough infrastructure capacity from bilateral agreements to multilateral agreements, air agreements, and whatnot. So most importantly, let's have the digitization working for Africa, and we have major steps to make going forward. You've stated that we have shortage of time. I had other points that I wanted to cover, but let me stop at that point.
Thank you very much. I think yourself and the other speakers have been very articulate in sharing, the real issues of e-commerce and digitalization in Africa as it affects businesses on the ground, from the policy angle as well, and from the research angle, drawing together work in this area over the last couple of years. Thank you so much for giving us your time, for sharing your views and opinions. And for me, thank you also to all those who were in participation, sharing comments and questions online. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to close this session.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.